The discharge papers were still warm from the printer when my world collapsed for the second time that week. The first time was the accident, a delivery truck running a red light, my car spinning twice before hitting the barrier. I remembered the sound more than anything. Not the crash itself, but the silence that followed. The kind of silence that tells you something has permanently changed. I had been in the hospital for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of surgeries, painkillers, and doctors speaking in careful tones that never quite matched the gravity in their eyes. My spine had taken the worst of the impact. The damage was serious. Walking again was possible, they said, but uncertain. My husband Cole had visited twice in those 3 weeks. Twice. He brought flowers the first time, and excuses the second. I told myself he was busy. His construction business was growing. He had contracts to chase, calls to take, meetings that couldn't wait. I made every excuse for him that he never bothered to make for himself. So when the nurse brought the discharge papers and said my husband was waiting outside, I felt something lift in my chest. Relief, maybe. Or just the desperate hope of a woman who needed to believe someone was still there. I should have known better. They helped me into a wheelchair at the hospital entrance. The evening air was cool and damp, and I could smell rain coming. A nurse held the door open, and I rolled out into the gray light feeling fragile in a way I had never felt before in my life. Cole was standing beside his car with his arms crossed. He didn't move toward me. He didn't come to take the handles of the wheelchair or squeeze my shoulder or say anything remotely close to the words I needed to hear. He just stood there, jaw tight, watching me the way you watch something that has become inconvenient. I tried to smile. "I'm so glad to be out of there," I said. He didn't return the smile. "Cole," I said, "can we go home?" He looked down at the ground, then back at me, and the look in his eyes was something I had never seen directed at me before. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder than anger. It was calculation. "This isn't going to work," he said. The air left my lungs. "I've been thinking about it for weeks. I can't do this, Naomi. I didn't sign up to take care of someone who can't walk. I have a business to run. I have a life." The rain started then. Light at first, then steady. He got into his car and drove away. I sat in the rain for longer than I should have. The nurse who had wheeled me out stood frozen in the doorway, unsure what to do. I couldn't move. Not because of the injury this time, but because my mind had gone completely blank. 8 years. 8 years of marriage, of building something together, of believing in a partnership that apparently only one of us had ever fully committed to. 8 years, and I was worth less than the inconvenience of my recovery. When I finally allowed the nurse to wheel me back inside, the hospital's social worker came to speak with me. She was a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Harmon who sat across from me with a notepad and kind eyes and asked if I had family I could contact. I thought of my sister Claire. Claire and I had never been particularly close, but she was all I had left. Our parents had passed within 2 years of each other, and Claire was the only family I could think of. I borrowed a phone and dialed her number with trembling fingers. She answered on the 3rd ring. I explained everything as calmly as I could, the accident, the injury, Cole leaving, the fact that I had nowhere to go. There was a long pause on her end. Then she cleared her throat. "Naomi, I don't think I can take that on right now." I closed my eyes. "I have my own things happening. It would be too much." The line went quiet between us. I thanked her for picking up and ended the call. Mrs. Harmon had stepped out briefly, and I was alone in the small consultation room when the door cracked open. A nurse I vaguely recognized from my ward leaned in. She was tall with a calm, unhurried way of moving that I had noticed during my stay.
"Her name Tag," said Diane.
"I'm sorry," she said quietly. I wasn't trying to overhear, but the walls here are thin. I didn't say anything. I was too empty to feel embarrassed. Diane stepped fully into the room. "I volunteer twice a week at a rehabilitation facility about 20 minutes from here. It's small, but it's good.
Clean.
The staff actually care." She paused. "They have a few supported housing rooms for patients in transition. I can make a call tonight if you want." I looked at her for a long time. I had just been abandoned by my husband and turned away by my sister within the space of 1 hour. And here's a stranger, someone who owed me absolutely nothing, offering me a door out of the dark. Why would you do that? I asked. She shrugged simply. Because no one should sit in the rain alone. That was all. No grand speech. No conditions. She pulled out her phone right there and made the call, and by the time Mrs. Harmon returned, there was somewhere waiting for me. The rehabilitation facility was called Cornerstone. It sat on a quiet street lined with oak trees, and when Diane drove me there that evening, the lights inside were warm and yellow against the dark sky. It looked like the kind of place that had been built by people who understood what broken felt like. The director, a compact, energetic woman named Dr. Carver, met us at the entrance. She shook my hand without looking at my wheelchair and spoke to me directly, not around me. "We'll get you assessed properly in the morning," she said. "Tonight, you rest." The room they gave me was small but clean. A single bed, a wooden side table, a window that looked out onto a garden. I lay there that first night listening to the rain finally stopping and thought about everything that had just happened. In the span of a single day, I had lost my home, my husband, and the version of my future I had always assumed was guaranteed. I had been told I was a burden by the two people who were supposed to love me most. But I had also been shown something else. A stranger had stepped forward when everyone else had stepped back. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then I made a quiet, private decision. I was done being someone people could afford to leave. I just didn't know yet how I was going to become someone they couldn't. The next morning, Dr. Carver sat across from me with my medical files and walked me through the reality of my injury plainly and without softening it. My spinal cord had not been fully severed. That was the good news. But the damage to the surrounding tissue and nerves was significant. I had some sensation in both legs, which the doctors said was a hopeful sign. But the road to walking again would be long. Possibly 2 years of intensive physical therapy. Possibly more. And there were no guarantees. Some patients regain full mobility, Dr. Carver said. Some regain partial. Some plateau earlier than we'd like. Your commitment to the process will be one of the biggest factors. Will I walk again? I asked. She didn't flinch. I believe you can. But I need to know if you believe it too. I thought about Cole driving away. I thought about Claire's silence on the phone. I thought about sitting in the rain with discharge papers in my lap. Yes, I said. I believe it. Dr. Carver nodded once, like that was all she needed to hear. She closed the file and said, "Then we start Monday." That night, I looked at myself in the small bathroom mirror for a very long time. I was thinner than I had ever been. My eyes looked tired and older than my 31 years. But underneath all of it, something was still burning. I pressed my hand flat against the mirror. Never helpless again. Not physically. Not financially. Not in any way. The first months at Cornerstone were the hardest of my life. Harder, even, than the hospital. In the hospital, I had been passive. Things were done to me. At Cornerstone, I was expected to fight every single day for progress that was sometimes too small to feel. My physiotherapist was a serious young man named Brett who had the patience of someone who had seen 100 people give up and had quietly decided that none of them would do so on his watch. He pushed me without cruelty and encouraged me without false comfort. When I cried from frustration, he handed me water and gave me 2 minutes, then told me we were continuing. Slowly, feeling crept back into my left leg. Then my right. Not fully. Not reliably. But enough to confirm that my body was still in the fight. During the hours I wasn't in therapy, I rested in the common room. It was there that I noticed how disorganized the facility's administrative side was. Patient schedules were scribbled on paper. Supply orders were duplicated. Financial records were kept in folders that no one seemed to fully understand. I started asking questions gently. Then I started offering small suggestions. Then, without anyone formally asking me to, I started helping. It was something to do. Something that used the part of me that wasn't broken. I had no idea it was about to become the thing that saved me. Dr. Carver noticed within 3 weeks. She came to find me one afternoon in the small back office where I had been reorganizing the supply invoices and asked how I had spotted the duplicate orders in the billing system. I explained my process, matching vendor codes, cross-referencing dates, flagging inconsistencies. It wasn't complicated. It was just logical. She looked at me quietly for a moment. "Did you work in administration before?" "No," I said. "I was a high school teacher. Business studies." She smiled slowly. That explained some things. She began including me more deliberately after that. I started reviewing the monthly cost reports. I helped restructure the patient scheduling system so that therapy rooms weren't double booked. I created a simple inventory tracker that cut the facility's wasted supply spending by nearly a third within 2 months. I was doing all of this from a wheelchair. After morning therapy sessions left my body aching, staying up later than I should have, because the work made me feel like a person with a purpose again. Diane stopped by one evening and found me surrounded by spreadsheets. She laughed softly. "You know, most people here just watch television at this hour." "Most people here weren't left in the rain," I said. She sat down across from me and stayed for an hour, just quietly keeping me company while I worked. Some kindnesses don't arrive with speeches. They just sit beside you. About 8 months after arriving at Cornerstone, Diane mentioned casually that she knew a medical supply company that was struggling badly. A small startup run by a man named Mr. Holt, who had the vision but not the operational structure to hold it together. The company was hemorrhaging money through poor logistics management and inconsistent supplier contracts. "He needs someone who can come in and stabilize things remotely," Diane said. "It doesn't require being on-site every day. He's flexible." I looked at her. "Are you suggesting me?" "I've been watching you rebuild this facility's entire back office for free for 8 months, she said simply. "Yes, I'm suggesting you." The meeting with Mr. Holt was done over video call. He was a tired-looking man in his 50s with a warm face and the specific exhaustion of someone watching something they built slowly fall apart. I listened to him describe his problems for 20 minutes and then told him exactly what I thought was wrong and how I would approach fixing it. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. "How soon can you start?" he asked. The salary wasn't large, but it was mine. The first money I had earned entirely on my own terms, without anyone's name attached to it but my own. I transferred the first payment to a new bank account I had opened that week, an account Cole knew nothing about. I sat with that fact for a while and felt something shift inside me. The work with Mr. Holt's company, Medcore Supplies, consumed me in the best possible way. I restructured their procurement process first, renegotiating 3 supplier contracts that had been bleeding them financially. Then I rebuilt their logistics tracking system and implemented a simple but effective invoicing protocol that immediately reduced their payment delays. Within 4 months, the losses slowed. Within 7 months, operations were stable. Mr. Holt called me one evening and said, "Whatever they paid you before, it wasn't enough." I laughed at that. He didn't know that before had been a wheelchair in a rehabilitation facility and a husband who drove away in the rain. During all of this, my therapy continued. Brett worked with me 5 days a week, and the progress, though still slow, was becoming undeniable. I could feel both legs now, genuinely feel them, not just the ghost sensation that had been there at the beginning. I was bearing partial weight on a set of parallel bars. I was building strength in muscles that had gone quiet after the accident. I didn't allow myself to think too far ahead. The present was enough. Each day had its own small victories, and I collected them carefully, like someone who had learned not to take anything for granted. I did not think about Cole, or rather, I tried not to. When his face appeared in my mind late at night, I turned my thoughts toward the spreadsheets, the contracts, the next thing to fix. Work was cleaner than grief. Work gave results. 14 months after the accident, I took my first unassisted steps. They were small and shaking, and I had to grab Brett's arm twice to steady myself. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, uncertain and unreliable beneath me. But they held. For 6 steps, they held. I sat back down in the wheelchair and cried so hard my chest hurt. Brett crouched in front of me and said nothing for a full minute. Then he said quietly, 6 steps today, 8 tomorrow. That's how this works. He was right. 8 the next day, 11 the day after. Progress was not linear. There were setbacks and plateaus and days when I could barely manage before the pain became too much. But the direction was always forward. At the same time, something else was moving forward too. Mr. Holt pulled me into a meeting call one afternoon and said he had been offered a major distribution contract with a hospital network in the South. It was bigger than anything MedCore had handled before. He didn't think he could manage it without expanding the team and reworking the entire operational structure. "I want to give you equity in the company," he said. "Not just a salary increase. Real ownership. You've earned it." I thought of Cole's voice. "I didn't sign up for this." "Yes," I said clearly. "I'll take it." The years passed the way years do when you are too busy rebuilding to watch the clock. I moved out of Cornerstone at the 2-year mark into a small apartment I rented with my own money. It was modest, 1 bedroom, a kitchen that fit only one person comfortably, windows that let in good morning light. I loved it more than I had ever loved the large house Cole and I had shared, because every single thing in it was mine. By then, I was walking with a cane. My gait was not perfect, but it was my own. Brett told me that some patients would have considered my level of recovery exceptional. I told him I wasn't finished yet, and he smiled like he had expected that answer. MedCore continued to grow. We secured the hospital network contract and delivered. Then a second. Then a regional government procurement deal that took us fully national. My equity stake grew with each new milestone, and I began to understand, in a real and practical way, what it meant to own something. I had heard very little about Cole directly. Mutual acquaintances mentioned occasionally that his construction business was expanding. He had remarried, I was told, a woman named Amber who appeared frequently on his social media with carefully posed photographs and captions about building a beautiful life. I saw one post once by accident and felt something I did not immediately recognize. I sat with it and eventually identified it as nothing. Not pain. Not bitterness. Just nothing. That emptiness told me I had moved further than I realized. In the 5th year after the accident, I received news that didn't surprise me but still landed heavily. Claire called, the first time she had dialed my number since the night she refused me, and said she had heard I was doing well. "I'm glad," she said carefully. I listened to her voice and heard what was underneath it. Guilt moves differently to regret. Guilt wants absolution. I had nothing to offer her that she hadn't already given herself. "I am doing well," I said calmly. "Thank you for calling." That was all. I didn't invite more. I didn't need to punish her, and I didn't need to pretend, either. I simply let the call be what it was, a small, late acknowledgement, and I moved on. At MedCore, I was now far more than a remote operations manager. Mr. Holt had made me a formal co-director the previous year, and my influence stretched across every department. I had hired a team of 12. I had developed a supplier network that covered 6 states. I had turned a struggling startup into something that industry contacts were beginning to take seriously. But the most significant development was still ahead. Mr. Holt called me one Tuesday afternoon with a heaviness in his voice that I recognized immediately as the sound of a man preparing to say something important. "I'm retiring, Naomi," he said. "My health won't allow me to continue at this pace. And I want to sell my controlling shares." He paused. "I want to sell them to you." The acquisition took 4 months to finalize. There were lawyers and valuations and conversations I had never imagined having a decade earlier when I was a high school teacher balancing a husband's ego and a home that never quite felt like mine. I bought Mr. Holt's controlling shares using a combination of the equity I had accumulated, a business loan I had spent 3 months preparing a watertight proposal for, and savings I had been quietly building since that first small salary. The day the transfer was confirmed, I sat in my office, a real office now, in a building that had MedCore's name on it, and was very still for a very long time. I had started with nothing. Worse than nothing. I had started from a wheelchair in the rain. I kept Mr. Holt's retirement quiet at his request, and my ownership was not announced publicly. MedCore continued to operate as it always had, and most external partners simply knew me as the company's director, a title I had held long enough that the change in ownership created no disruption. I liked the quiet of it. I had spent years building in silence, and silence had served me well. The company was fully mine now. Not borrowed. Not shared. Not dependent on anyone's goodwill or approval. Every decision, every contract, every direction the company moved in, mine. I walked into the office that morning without my cane. My steps were still careful, still deliberate, but they were fully my own. I had not needed the cane for 6 weeks. The contract bid arrived on a Thursday. My operations coordinator, a sharp young woman named Paige, brought it to my attention during our weekly review meeting. A construction and facility services company had submitted a proposal for our building maintenance and supply contract, a significant deal that covered 3 of our distribution centers. Their pricing is competitive, Paige said, flipping through the pages. Mid-range company. Been around for about 12 years. Some good project history, though their recent financials look a bit stretched. She slid the folder across the desk to me. I picked it up and turned to the cover page. The company name was written in clean professional font at the top, Coleman Ward Construction and Facility Services. Beneath it, the director's name, Coleman Ward. The room was very quiet. Paige was still talking, something about the bid timeline and the competing proposals, but her words became a low hum underneath the sound of my own heartbeat. I had not seen that name written formally in nearly 10 years. I set the folder down carefully. My hands were steady. That surprised me slightly. Keep it in review, I said evenly. I'll go through the full proposal this weekend. Paige nodded and moved on to the next item. I spent the rest of the meeting listening and responding appropriately, and showing nothing. That evening, alone in my apartment, I read every page of the proposal. The business history was solid for the first 8 years. Real projects. Reasonable growth. Cole had clearly built something with genuine substance in the years after our divorce. But the last 2 years told a different story. Reading between the careful corporate language of the proposal, I could see the signs I had been trained to recognize: overextended credit, deferred supplier payments, a large overseas project that had clearly underperformed and left a gap in the balance sheet. His company was not collapsing. Not yet. But it was leaning, the way structures lean before they fall if no one shores up the foundation. I closed the folder and looked out my window at the city lights. Memories came without invitation. The hospital entrance. The rain. His face when he said cripple like it was a verdict instead of a word. The sound of his engine as he drove away. I had told myself for years that I felt nothing when I thought about Cole. And mostly that was true. But sitting with his proposal in my lap, I discovered something more precise than nothing. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was a clear-eyed recognition. He had walked away from a person he underestimated. And now, entirely by accident, he had walked back toward her without knowing it. I picked up the folder again and made notes in the margin, calm and professional. Whatever came next, I would not rush it. The standard process for a contract of this size was a face-to-face meeting with shortlisted bidders. Paige had already identified 3 proposals worth advancing, and Cole's company was among them on numbers alone. I approved the shortlist and authorized the meeting invitations. When Cole's acceptance came back, it was prompt and professional. His assistant confirmed the appointment for a Wednesday at 11. No indication that he had any idea who he was meeting. Medcor's director was listed on all official correspondence as N. Lawson, my maiden name, which I had resumed after the divorce. Naomi Lawson. Not a name Cole would have connected to me. He had always called me Naomi, but the last name was different, and the woman he had left in the rain was not a company director. She was a high school teacher in a wheelchair. I told Paige I would lead the meeting personally. She raised an eyebrow slightly. I didn't usually handle supplier meetings at this level directly, but said nothing. She trusted my judgment. The night before, I lay awake for a while. Not with anxiety exactly. More with a kind of solemn awareness. I had not planned this. I had not engineered it. Life had simply arranged itself into a moment, and I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be when I walked into that room. I decided I was going to be exactly who I had become.
Steady, clear, fair,
and completely unafraid. I arrived at the conference room 10 minutes early, as was my habit. I wore a charcoal gray suit I had bought the previous year for a board presentation. Clean lines, nothing excessive. I carried no cane. I walked in with a slight deliberateness that most people mistook for composure rather than the careful management of a body still teaching itself to move confidently. The room was set up simply. A long table, water glasses, the company's materials laid out. Paige stood at the far end, reviewing her notes. 2 other staff members were already seated. At 11 exactly, Cole walked in. He was older in the ways people become older when difficulty has lived on their face long enough to leave marks. His hairline had moved back. There was gray at his temples that hadn't been there. He wore a good suit, but it was slightly tight at the shoulders in a way that suggested it had been fitted when things were going better. He entered with a confident smile, the rehearsed, professional warmth of a man who had done many pitches, and swept his gaze across the room. When his eyes found me, the smile stopped. Not gradually.
Completely.
The color shifted in his face. His body went very still. He stared for a moment that stretched 3 times longer than it should have, and then he said my name in a voice that barely made it out of his throat. Naomi. I looked at him evenly. Good morning, Mr. Ward. Please have a seat. He sat down slowly, like a man lowering himself into water whose temperature he couldn't read. For the first few minutes, I guided the meeting through its formal structure. Introductions, agenda, timeline for the decision. Professional, measured, ordinary. I watched him try to locate himself within what was happening, watched him recalibrate in real time. He was a capable man, Cole. I had never denied that. When he found his footing midway through the first 10 minutes, he began presenting his company's proposal with genuine confidence. He knew his numbers. He spoke well about his team and their project history. He made a strong case. I listened carefully and took notes and asked precise questions, the same questions I would have asked anyone. Then, about 20 minutes in, he paused between sections and said quietly, so quietly that only I, seated at the head of the table, could hear clearly, I didn't know it would be you. I know, I said. Naomi, The proposal, I said calmly, tapping the folder in front of me. You are on slide 14. He looked at me for a moment longer, something moving across his face that I didn't try to name. Then he turned back to his presentation and continued. Whatever he felt in that room, he was professional enough to manage it.
So was I.
But the tension of what was unsaid sat between us like a third presence at the table. After the formal session ended and the other staff members stepped out, Cole remained seated. I had expected this. I stayed as well, straightening papers slowly. The room was quiet. You look well, he said. I am well, I replied. He was quiet for another moment. Then, with the specific carefulness of a man choosing his words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, I heard you'd recovered. I was glad. I looked at him directly. Were you? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I know what I did was wrong, he said. I've thought about it. He shifted slightly in his chair. I was afraid. That's not an excuse, I know. I panicked, and I handled it in the worst way possible. I've always known that. I kept my voice even. You told me you didn't sign up to take care of a cripple. He flinched. The word landed the way I had known it would. I said things I'm ashamed of, he said quietly. I studied him for a moment. The man in front of me was genuinely sorry. I believed that. Sorry people were not uncommon. What they were sorry for had already happened, and sorry couldn't undo rain, or a wheelchair on a pavement, or a sister who said burden. I appreciate you saying that, I said. And I meant it neutrally. I'll be in touch about the contract decision within 2 weeks. He came back. Not officially. Not through Paige's scheduling system. He sent a message to my direct office line 3 days after the meeting, asking if we could speak privately. I sat with the request for a full day before responding. I agreed to a brief call. When he rang, he didn't spend long on pleasantries. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had rehearsed something and decided at the last moment to abandon the rehearsal. The company is in trouble, he said. Real trouble. I have 3 outstanding supplier debts that are overdue, and I have a project in the East that came in significantly over budget. The contract with MedCorp, if I get it, could stabilize everything. If I don't,
He stopped.
I'm not asking you for charity. I'm asking you to consider what my team submitted on its merits. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Then I said, I've been considering it exactly on its merits. That's the only way I know how to work. I know, he said. I know that's who you are. There was a long pause. Outside my window, the city was doing what cities do, moving indifferent, constant. The same man who told me I was a burden, I said finally, is now telling me who I am. That's a strange thing, Cole. He had no answer for that. I hadn't expected one. I'll be in touch, I said, and ended the call. I spent 2 full days reviewing his proposal again. Not because I was undecided about the business case. I had been clear on that from the first reading. But because I wanted to be absolutely certain that my decision was grounded in the numbers and not in anything else. I was rigorous. I cross-checked every figure. I had Page independently review the financial appendix. I compared his proposal against the other 2 shortlisted bids line by line. His company's operational history was genuinely solid. Their equipment quality and project delivery record were good. But the current financial instability was not a minor concern. A supplier in cash flow difficulty was a liability risk for a contract of this size. If his company took on our work and then failed midway through delivery, the disruption to our distribution centers would be significant. The second shortlisted bidder had cleaner current financials and comparable capabilities. I wrote my assessment carefully, documenting every consideration. Then I called Paige into my office, walked her through the evaluation, and told her my decision. I did not tell her who Cole was to me. That information was irrelevant to the outcome, and it was mine to keep. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment and thought about the version of me that had sat in the rain 10 years ago. I thought about what she had needed and what she had become instead. I felt unexpectedly at peace. The formal communication went out on a Friday. A politely worded letter thanking Mr. Ward's company for their competitive proposal and informing them that on this occasion the contract had been awarded to another supplier.
Standard.
Professional. Final. I had Paige handle the delivery so that there was no ambiguity about the process. Every step had been documented. Every decision had a paper trail. I had done nothing I could not defend in a boardroom or a mirror. Cole called my direct line within the hour. I answered. I got the letter, he said. His voice was controlled, but thin at the edges. Yes, I said. Was it because of me? Because of what happened between us? I had expected this question. I had prepared for it not by crafting a response, but by being certain enough in my own conscience that the answer came simply. No, I said. Your current financial position presents a delivery risk we cannot absorb. The other bidder's profile is stronger at this point in time. I paused. This is business, Cole. That's all this is. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I understand. And I believed he did. Not just the words, but the weight behind them. That what he was experiencing was not punishment. It was consequence, the long, ordinary consequence of decisions made, and not made, over years. I hope things stabilize for you, I said. And I meant that too. 6 months later, I heard through a business contact that Cole's company had filed for voluntary restructuring. It wasn't a collapse exactly, more a managed retreat, a formal acknowledgement that the foundations needed rebuilding before the structure could continue. His assets were under review. His projects were put on hold. I felt no satisfaction when I heard this. I want to be honest about that, because the easier story would be to say I felt vindicated, triumphant, that a quiet justice had been served and I savored it. But the truth was quieter and more complete than that. I felt the specific stillness of someone who has walked a very long road and arrived somewhere. Diane came to visit that same week. She and I had kept our friendship alive across the years in the way that genuinely good friendships survive, not constantly but durably. She brought food and we sat in my apartment eating and talking about ordinary things, the way you can only do with someone who knew you when you were broken and loves you anyway. At some point she looked at me and said, "Are you okay? With everything?" I considered the question seriously, as it deserved. "I am," I said. "Completely." She nodded and seemed to believe me.
She was right too.
It was the most honest thing I had said in a long time. We crossed paths one last time. It was a Tuesday morning at a business networking event hosted by a healthcare industry association. I was one of the keynote speakers. I arrived early, as I always did, and was standing near the registration table with a coffee when I saw him come through the door. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. He was the same height, the same build, but in the way people look when the external structure of their confidence has been quietly removed. He saw me almost immediately. The space between us was perhaps 12 feet, and we stood in it for a moment without moving. I watched him consider coming over and decide against it. Then reconsider. He walked toward me. "Naomi," he said. "Cole," I replied. "I heard you're speaking today," he said. "Yes." He glanced around, then back at me. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. "I know that. What I did, leaving you like that, it's not something an apology covers." I looked at him for a long moment. The rain, the wheelchair, the word he had used like a door slamming shut. "No," I said gently. "It isn't." He nodded. He seemed to have come not expecting forgiveness and found that nothing had changed on that front. I set my coffee down. "I have to go prepare," I said. "Take care of yourself, Cole." I turned and walked away. Steady steps. No cane. No hesitation. Behind me, the room filled with voices and movement and the ordinary busy noise of people building things. Ahead of me, a stage and a microphone, and a room full of people waiting to hear what I had learned. I had learned this. The people who walk away from you in your worst moment are not escaping your weakness. They are walking away from the very strength that would have carried them through their own. And that strength? It never needed their permission to grow.